I took 3 for myself. The third simply stared at nothing. These chilling words from a soldier's recovered letter expose a reality far grimmer than any Hollywood movie dares to show. Beyond the battlefield victories lay a calculated ritual of domination, where human beings were listed alongside livestock in cargo manifests. This is the untold story of the women who paid the ultimate price for Rome's eternal glory, erased from history until now. History is often written by the victors, a maxim that has never been more chillingly accurate than when applied to the Roman Empire. We are raised on stories of the Pax Romana, of aqueducts and roads, of the civilizing force of the legions that brought order to a barbaric world. We envision the triumphal processions winding through the eternal city, banners snapping in the wind, armor gleaming under the Mediterranean sun. But beneath the polished marble and the soaring rhetoric of the Senate lay a foundation built on a brutality so systematic, so industrial in its scope, that it defies the sanitized versions of history we are taught in school. When the dust settled on a conquered city, when the men of fighting age had been executed or conscripted for the arena, a different kind of war began. It was a war waged not against soldiers, but against women. This is the story of the praeda belli feminarum, the female war spoils, and the terrifyingly bureaucratic machine that transformed human beings into currency, status symbols, and objects of conquest by proxy. The popular imagination might picture the aftermath of a Roman siege as a chaotic frenzy of looting and violence. While such moments undoubtedly occurred, the true horror of the Roman system lay in its order. Violence was not merely a byproduct of war. It was a state-sanctioned procedure. According to military reports and letters that have survived the ravages of 2 millennia, the process of enslavement was treated with the same detachment as the logistical distribution of grain. In 106 AD, following Trajan's conquest of Dacia, approximately 15,000 women were taken captive. The official records speak of distribution and transfer, sterile words that mask a reality of visceral terror. The process typically began in the central square of a fallen town. Here, the surviving women, often those young enough to be considered valuable stock, were assembled. They were stripped naked and forced to stand for hours, sometimes days, under the scrutiny of the occupying legion. This was the deselection process. It was a ritual of humiliation designed to strip away dignity before stripping away identity. Commanders and high-ranking officers would take their pick of the most physically desirable captives, marking them with red dye on the shoulder. The rest were allocated to the rank-and-file soldiers or set aside for the slave traders who followed the armies like vultures. This wasn't just about sexual gratification. It was a political act. It was a demonstration of total power, a message sent to any remaining population. This is what happens to your wives, your daughters, your sisters. The emotional toll of this system is often lost in the dry statistics of history, but occasionally a voice breaks through the silence. A fragment of a letter discovered in Pompeii, written by a legionary named Marcus Flavius during a campaign in Germania, offers a haunting glimpse into the mindset of the conquerors. Writing home with a casual, almost bored detachment, Flavius described the aftermath of a raid. I took 3 for myself on the first night. The youngest cried without stopping. The second tried to bite. The third simply stared at nothing, as if she were already gone. I preferred the third. She was easier. That single word, easier, echoes across the centuries. It reveals the fundamental truth of this violence. It was about the erasure of the person. The woman who stared at nothing had already disassociated, her spirit broken by a trauma so profound that her mind had fled her body. To Flavius, she was preferable not because of who she was, but because she had ceased to be a person and had become, effectively, an object. Once the initial distribution was complete, the bureaucratic machine of the empire took over. The women were branded, literally burned with hot irons, with symbols identifying the legion that captured them or the campaign they were part of. These marks were often placed on the face or arms, ensuring that their status as conquered property could never be concealed. Then came the march. Chained together in groups, these women were forced to walk hundreds of kilometers to coastal ports. There, they were stored in damp, dark warehouses, the same facilities used for storing olive oil and grain, waiting for transport ships. A commercial inventory preserved in Alexandria from 115 AD lists the cargo of a merchant vessel: 340 amphorae of wine, 120 barrels of wheat, 89 women from Judea, 14 Berber horses. The listing is devastating in its banality. Women, wine, and horses, all just logistical units with a calculated monetary value. The journey by sea was a nightmare of its own. Kept below decks in cramped, filthy conditions, many died of disease, dehydration, or despair. Roman agricultural writer Columella, in a treatise on estate management, estimated that a loss rate of 20% to 30% for female captives during transport was acceptable. To the traders, these women were perishable goods. If some spoiled on the way to market, it was simply the cost of doing business. Upon arrival in Rome or other major cities, the survivors faced the slave markets. Here, wealthy buyers would inspect them as one inspects livestock, probing flesh, checking teeth, forcing mouths open. The most desirable might be sold into wealthy households, but for thousands of others, the destination was the brothel. Prostitution in Rome was legal, regulated, and taxed. It was a booming industry, and female prisoners of war were its most lucrative commodity. Why? Because violating the daughter of an enemy offered the ordinary Roman citizen a psychological share in the empire's victory. A baker or a cobbler who had never held a sword could, for a few coins, dominate a woman from Gaul or Britannia. It was a way to feel like a conqueror by proxy. Graffiti found on the walls of a brothel in Pompeii captures this sentiment with crude brevity. Here I penetrated a Briton. Rome is eternal. Even the most intimate act was twisted into a performative declaration of national superiority. In these establishments, women lost their names entirely. They were known only by their origin. The Gaul, the German, the Jew. Trapped in cubicles barely larger than a coffin, they serviced dozens of men a day. The life expectancy in these places was brutally short, typically no more than 5 years. A medical text by Cyrenus of Ephesus advises brothel owners to renew their stock every 3 or 4 years, noting that after this period, the merchandise loses its commercial value. Resistance, when it occurred, was often met with overwhelming force, but the spirit of defiance sometimes flickered in the historical record. The most famous example is Boudica, the warrior queen of the Iceni in Britain. When she rebelled against Roman rule, the empire's response was to publicly flog her and violate her daughters, not as a crime of passion, but as a calculated administrative punishment meant to humiliate her before her people. But there were smaller, quieter rebellions. A document from the 2nd century records a revolt of enslaved women in a rural settlement in Spain, led by a Germanic woman known only as the red-haired one. They killed their master and his family. Before her execution, she told the judge, "You taught us that the world belongs to the violent. We only practiced the lesson." More often, however, the resistance was internal, a retreat into the self. The silence of the historical record regarding these women is not an accident. It is a feature of the system. They were denied the tools to write their own stories. We have no diaries from the slave markets, no memoirs from the brothels. We have only the accounts of the men who bought, sold, and used them. Why does this matter today? Why dwell on the atrocities of an empire that fell 1,500 years ago? Because Rome is the template for Western civilization. We copy their laws, their senate, their architecture. We admire their greatness. But to admire the structure without acknowledging the bodies buried in the foundation is a form of complicity. The system that Rome perfected, the conversion of human beings into other, into cargo, into spoils, did not die with the Caesars. It echoes in every conflict where rape is used as a weapon of war. It survives in the human trafficking networks that still treat women as stock to be renewed. There is a tombstone in a London museum found near an old Roman fort. The inscription is brief and anonymous. Here once was a woman, her name forgotten, her homeland forgotten. May the gods show her more mercy than Rome did. It is a stark reminder that behind every triumphal column and every chapter of military glory, there are millions of silent ghosts. They were women who loved and were loved, who had names and dreams, all of which were fed into the maw of an imperial machine. By telling their story now, by refusing to look away from the uncomfortable truth, we offer them the only thing Rome never did, the dignity of being remembered as human.